So, hello everybody, Enda Benson here. So today we're talking about actually Martin Luther and his overall theology and the actual type of a person he was. He actually was a monk for 2 years between 1505 and 1507, and then he became a Catholic priest for about 13 years after that. But actually, just to go back, recap something I covered in a previous video, in 1517 in October, he put up 95 theses, which he mainly an objection to indulgences and that sort of thing that was going on in Germany at the time. And over the next couple of years, of course, he got into major conflict and argument with the Catholic Church over the years 1518, 1519, with the result that by 1520 he was in serious conflict with the Church, and he wrote 3 books actually in that year. The first of the books actually was, he was beginning to recognize that it was going to be extremely difficult to get reform inside the church itself. He had talked to a number of bishops at this stage. He was in communication, either direct or indirect communication with the Pope. And he recognized that it was going to be quite difficult to actually get the type of reform that he was hoping to achieve. So at this stage, in August 1520, he wrote a book whereby he appealed to the German nobility to get involved in church affairs. There's a very good chance that Martin Luther didn't have the actual foresight to understand the implication of inviting the nobility to get involved in church affairs, because it led to a tremendous amount of conflict over the decades and over the centuries ahead, actually, for that matter. But at this stage, he was extremely anxious to bring about the type of reform that he believed was necessary. So he invited the nobles of Germany to get involved in church affairs. And that had huge implications in the years ahead. And that same year, he actually wrote 3 books in 1520. That same year, actually, he wrote a second book called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And in this book, he actually outlines that most of the sacraments are, in his view, totally unnecessary. Pilgrimages, rosaries, various different last rites and all this. This is all, as far as Luther is concerned, total waste of time. He believes he's discovered the original meaning of the gospel, and he puts a tremendous emphasis on Paul's writings. He takes a certain interpretation of them, that faith is the only thing that matters. We'll go into that in more detail actually in a future video. I've also dealt with it in a previous video if you'd like to subscribe. But the third book he wrote in 1520, which captures his overall theology, is a book called The Freedom of the Christian. And here he outlines the idea that a Christian is perfectly free internally, and also should obey the actual rules of civil society and that type of thing. So he outlines his basic theology here of what he calls, or what's called later by theologians, faith alone. And of course, these 3 books actually inviting the nobility to come in, destroying the authority of the church, and bringing about a new system of belief in regard to faith alone, means that Luther is actually in complete conflict with the church by the end of 1520. And in January 21, he's actually excommunicated from the church. A few months later that year, he finds himself at a thing called the Diet of Worms, which is actually the highest type of trial in the Roman Empire at the time. The emperor himself, Charles V, actually attends the actual diet. A lot of bishops, a lot of the nobility are all there. And Luther takes a stand at this point, and he says that he'll be said by nothing other than reason, his conscience, and Scripture alone. He rejects the authority of the church. He rejects the sole authority of the Pope. He rejects church councils. He claims they could be in error and all that type of thing. So in the aftermath of that, of course, he's declared an outlaw, and therefore he's captured by the prince of that particular territory, Frederick the Wise. His men capture him and bring him to a castle where over the next few months he translates the actual New Testament, which and when he's translating the version of Romans at 3:28, he emphasizes his new faith, which is the verses 3:28, one of the most famous verses in the Bible. It says, a person is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Paul, when he wrote that, he was talking about actually the Roman, he was talking about the Jewish law, that you don't need to be circumcised and all that. You don't need to be a Jew in order to be a Christian. But Luther took a different meaning out of that. He said that he believed that the works of the law are all to do with the various different rituals that the church was involved in, and he rejected all that, and therefore his translation of the Bible was not that a man is justified by faith apart from works of the law, but rather a man is justified by faith alone. And he adds that word alone, even though it's not in the original text. In fact, faith alone is not in the Bible anywhere other than in the letter of James, which says that a person is not justified by faith alone, the absolute opposite to what Luther is promoting. But the actual books he has written created a lot of different types of unrest in Germany, and the tenant farmers, of course, see his writings as there's one particular leader. His name is Thomas Munster, and his interpretation of Luther's writings is that there should be greater justice in this world, and that the Bible supports the idea of greater justice for peasants and farmers. And as a result of that, of course, he leads a revolt in the mid-20s in 1524-25. That leads to what's called the Peasants' Revolt. It's the first enormous consequences of the Reformation, in the sense that 70,000 people get killed as a result of the clash between the peasants and the actual nobility. And Luther is left with a difficult choice at this stage, because on the one hand he recognizes that the peasants have a very just cause. They're paying very high taxes, they're working very long hours for a very low income, and you have the nobility basically living the high life. And from a justice point of view, of course, Luther recognizes that the divine law is on the side of the peasants, but actually he supports the nobility, which is surprising to a lot of people and disheartening to a lot of people, but he strongly supports the nobility. And the reason for that is that a couple of years earlier, he has invited them in to actually carry out reforms of the church, and he recognizes that they have the power, they have the money, they have the strength, and without the support of the nobility, he has no chance of actually carrying through these reforms that he envisages. So he supports the nobility very strongly in 25. He supports them because he actually believes that without their support he can't carry through the reforms, as I said. And he writes a book called Against the Murdering Hordes of Peasants, the murdering hordes of peasants and thieves. And this loses him a lot of credibility with the ordinary people in Germany, but he considers it worth it in the sense that he has nobility on his side. Later on that year, actually towards the end of the year, I think it's around October, he writes probably his most important theological work, which is called The Bondage of the Will. And that book outlines the idea that it's actually a book that's written against another great theologian whose name is Erasmus, who wrote a book earlier that year, a few months earlier, which was called On Free Will, which is talking about the mankind's cooperation with the grace of God in order to achieve salvation. Luther completely rejects this idea. His idea is that man has nothing to do with their own salvation, that it's entirely the work of God, and that faith alone is actually all that's required in order to achieve salvation. That's the heart of Luther's doctrine. And he writes this book, as I said, called The Bondage of the Will, which means that the will, human will, is bound to sin, that there is no capacity to do any good without actually the grace of God. Everything is to do with the grace of God. Nothing is to do with mankind's free will. It's 100%, 0%. That's his concept of human free will in terms of the actual salvation, which he thinks is by far the most important thing. And of course it is but It's a disagreement with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has always said that free will plays a role. It cooperates with God's grace. Both are essential. Salvation is by the death of Jesus Christ, but there's also a requirement to cooperate with that salvation in various ways by keeping the commandments and doing good works, etc. So Luther rejects this idea in this book, The Bondage of the Will, and that's later elaborated and developed by John Calvin in ideas like predestination, total depravity, and that type of thing that he writes in his book. He kind of exaggerates what Luther has already said, but Luther basically has put down the foundation of this idea of total depravity. And of course, in the 1520s, there's more radical reformers who actually have different ideas to Luther. And whereas in 21 at the Diet of Worms, Luther appears like a national hero when he talks about he'll be said by nothing other than Scripture alone. However, that particular doctrine finds itself in some difficulty as the years go by, because for the very simple reason that if he's going to be said by Scripture alone, there's no reason why other people won't be said by Scripture alone as well. However, unfortunately, different meanings can be taken out of different parts of the Bible, and that's what he discovered by the end of the first decade. He was in conflict with more radical reformers who wanted to rebaptize everybody. They're called Anabaptists. They were more radical than him, but his bigger problem actually was with a great theologian from Switzerland who was more radical in his ideas. He wanted the church to be reformed by the state, and laws should be brought about to actually reform the church and get rid of anything that Zwingli and Luther disagreed with. However, they were in agreement in most things, but not in regard to the Eucharist. What happened was that the Prince of Hesse, Prince Philip, he decided that it was time to unite the reformers under a common platform, and he brought the two leaders of the reform movement together, Luther and Zwingli, at his own castle, Malberg Castle, in 1529. And this is probably the most pivotal moment of the Reformation. It's probably the most important single moment, apart from the time that Luther actually posted the 95 Theses. Because here there's an attempt to bring about a unified platform of all the reform movement. And there's a 15-point program proposed, and they agree on 14 points. However, they actually cannot agree on the meaning of the Eucharist. And the reason for that is quite simply is that Zwingli believes the Eucharist is nothing more than a piece of bread. It's just a symbol of Christ. However, Luther is more informed than Zwingli about the actual writings of the Church Fathers, especially the great Church Father Augustine. And Luther is very much aware that right back to the beginning of Christianity, the Eucharist was not regarded as just a symbol. It was regarded as the real presence of Christ, the real presence of the risen Christ, not the real presence of Jesus, the physical person. That's something that's very often confused. But the apostles and the church fathers that knew the apostles and all their writings actually indicate that the early Christians actually did believe in the Eucharist. Luther was very much aware of that, and at the meeting in the castle of Malberg Castle in 1529, he wrote on the table with a piece of chalk, "This is my body," because these are the words that Jesus used at the Last Supper. And whereas Catholic theologians like Thomas Aquinas had attempted to give some explanation to this in terms of philosophy, Luther rejected the idea of philosophy. All he was going on was, this was the words of Christ. There was another word in that language, Latin or Arabic, whatever language it was, for the word represent. Jesus didn't use the word represent. He used the word, "This is my body." And on that basis, Luther wouldn't budge on this issue. As a result, this split the Reform movement in two. Later, Zwingli was killed a couple of years later in 31 in a battle in Switzerland where they were trying to actually impose the Reform doctrine on the entire country, but that failed. But a couple of years later, in 34, just to continue with the Luther story, Luther translates the entire Bible in 34. This is 12 years after he actually translated the New Testament in 1522, and he was just 39 years of age at that stage. But this is several years later, 12 years later, in 34, it takes him to translate the entire Old Testament. And in the process of actually translating the Bible, he discovers a number of books that don't quite agree with his total emphasis on faith alone. He believes that's what Paul's was saying, but actually a more comprehensive understanding of Paul's writings, and this is admitted by loads of theologians at this stage on all sides, would actually suggest that Paul is not really promoting the idea or the doctrine of faith alone. He's also talking about the need for good works and love and all that type of thing, and the transformation of the Christian throughout life rather than a once-off situation. So he translates the Bible, but he actually takes 7 books from the Bible and he puts them into a separate section, which he claims is that they're not on a par with Scripture. The church fathers, 3 or 4 meetings of church councils actually decided what Scripture was. There were 73 books in the original Bible. There's still actually 73 books in the Bible, the Catholic Bible, because the Council of Trent, a couple of decades later, actually reaffirmed the idea that the actual original Scripture is 73 books, not 66 books. Luther didn't actually remove these 7 books. Some people misunderstand this. He didn't remove the 7 books from the Bible because he didn't have the authority to do that. They were Scripture. They were always regarded as Scripture. And in the 1520s, 1530s, all the great theologians and everyone else regarded these 7 books as Scripture. But what Luther did was he sort of create a separate section for them between the Old Testament and the New Testament. He put in these 7 books. And he said that they were good to read, but not actually on a par with Scripture. So here we have basically a person who was a Catholic priest going against the entire tradition of the church fathers, the church councils, everyone else. He decides that 7 books are not belonging to Scripture, even though they have been. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, quoted 250 to 300 times from the book of Sirach. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas quoted hundreds of times from the Book of Wisdom and the Book of Sirach. They're by far the 2 most important books of the 7 that were actually removed. The other books, Baruch and Judah, they're only maybe a few pages, 8 or 10 pages, but actually Luther removed these books because they're to do with praying for the dead, and one of them says that almsgiving contributes to salvation, and you should pray for your relatives and pray for people you knew and all that. But of course that contradicts the whole idea of faith alone. So he removed these. Well, he didn't actually remove them, but he sidetracked these books in the Bible. They were later removed, a couple of 100 years later, because actually printers and people like that decided to remove them out of the Bible altogether about 300 years later, in about 1826, 1830, sometime around there. But actually, that's why there's a difference in the Catholic Bible and the Protestant Bible today, that actually these books don't agree with the ideology of faith alone. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I intend to actually go through a bit more detail on this, because actually one of the things that I've found difficult to understand myself is how a religion that's based on love actually converted into anger and war and conflict so quickly. And next week I'll be dealing with the developments in Switzerland, where Zwingli went back after his meeting with Luther, where they couldn't agree on the meaning of the Eucharist. He went back to Switzerland thinking that he could enforce the Reformed doctrine on the entire country. But that led to war. We'll be dealing with that next week. So if you'd like to see that, please subscribe. And thank you very much for watching for today, and goodbye for now.